The sun beat mercilessly on Grace Anderson's pale skin as she stumbled across the endless Kansas prairie, her once fine blue dress now tattered and stained with the red dust that seemed to penetrate everything in this godforsaken land. The year was 1875, and she had been abandoned, left to die by the very man who had promised to love her until death parted them. How cruelly ironic those wedding vows seemed now. Grace collapsed onto her knees, her parched lips cracking as she gasped for breath. 3 days without proper water, surviving only on morning dew and what little moisture she could extract from prairie plants. The wagon train had continued westward without her after Richard had convinced them she'd run off with another man. In truth, he'd drugged her tea, dragged her from their wagon in the dead of night, and left her unconscious miles from camp punishment for discovering his scheme to steal the group's collective savings. "I will not die here," she whispered fiercely, forcing herself to stand once more. "I will not give him the satisfaction." But determination alone couldn't overcome thirst and exhaustion. As the blazing sun reached its zenith, Grace's vision blurred, and the vast prairie tilted sideways as she crumpled to the ground. 50 miles away, Xavier Russell adjusted his worn leather hat against the punishing sun as his eyes studied the horizon. At 26, he'd already lived several lifetimes' worth of experiences, from cattle drives to skirmishes with hostile parties and everything in between. A seasoned tracker and horseman, he'd earned a reputation as one of the most reliable scouts in Kansas territory. Today, however, he wasn't tracking outlaws or buffalo. He was simply heading home after delivering a herd to Dodge City. "What do you think, Pepper?" Xavier patted his black stallion's neck. "Should make it to the creek by nightfall if we keep this pace." The horse snorted in response, and Xavier smiled. After weeks of sleeping under the stars with only his mount for company, he was looking forward to the simple comforts of his small homestead: a rail bed, hot food that wasn't beans, and perhaps a bath that didn't involve icy creek water. As they crested a small rise, Xavier spotted something unusual in the distance: a disruption in the natural pattern of the grass. Frowning, he guided Pepper closer, eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. "Whoa, boy," he murmured, sliding from the saddle when they were still a good distance away. Years of caution had kept him alive in a land where many men died young. He approached slowly, tracking what appeared to be footprints, small ones, too small for a man, weaving an erratic path across the prairie. "A woman," he said aloud, crouching to examine the tracks more carefully. Alone and disoriented, he could read the story in the earth as clearly as others read books: the increasingly uneven gait, the places where she'd fallen, the desperate, meandering path of someone lost and likely without water. Xavier stood, scanning the horizon with renewed purpose. These tracks were fresh, perhaps a day old at most. Whoever this woman was, she couldn't have gotten far in this heat without supplies. "Come on, Pepper," he said, swinging back into the saddle. "Someone needs our help." Xavier followed the tracks for nearly 2 hours, concern growing as the trail became more erratic. The woman had clearly been struggling, falling frequently. Then, just as the afternoon heat began to wane, he spotted something blue against the golden prairie grass. He approached cautiously, but his caution gave way to urgency when he realized it was indeed a woman, lying motionless on the ground. Dismounting quickly, Xavier rushed to her side, dropping to his knees beside her still form. Miss, can you hear me?" he called, gently turning her over. Despite the dirt and sunburn on her face, he could see she was young, perhaps 20 or so, and beautiful, with delicate features and sun-lightened auburn hair that had partially escaped its pins. Her breathing was shallow, her skin hot to the touch. "Heat exhaustion," he muttered, quickly uncorking his canteen. He lifted her head carefully, dribbling small amounts of water between her cracked lips. "Easy now, just a little at a time." Grace's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. "Am I dead?" she whispered hoarsely. "Not if I have anything to say about it," Xavier replied, relief washing over him as she responded. "My name is Xavier Russell. I found your tracks and followed them here." She struggled to sit up, but lacked the strength. "Grace," she managed. "Grace Anderson. Miss Anderson, you need water and shade. I'm going to take you to my homestead. It's not far, but we need to move before nightfall." He hesitated. "Can you tell me what happened?" How you came to be out here alone. Grace's eyes welled with tears. My husband. He left me to die. Xavier's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice gentle. Well, he didn't succeed. Let's keep it that way. He lifted her carefully, surprised at how light she felt in his arms, and carried her to Pepper. With practiced ease, he mounted while holding her, settling her securely in front of him. Hold on if you can, he instructed, placing her hands on the saddle horn before wrapping one arm around her waist to keep her steady. We'll ride slow and steady. As they made their way across the prairie, Xavier kept Grace talking to ensure she remained conscious. She told him fragments of her story, how she'd married Richard Anderson back in St. Louis, how he'd convinced her to join a wagon train bound for California, and how she'd discovered his plan to steal from their traveling companions. I was a fool, she whispered, her voice gaining a little strength as the water revived her. I thought he loved me, but he only wanted access to my family's connections for his schemes. The only fool was him, Xavier replied firmly. Leaving someone to die like that, it's worse than shooting a man in the back. As the sun began to set, painting the prairie in hues of gold and purple, Xavier's modest homestead came into view, a sturdy log cabin with a small barn and corral, nestled near a creek lined with cottonwood trees. There it is, he said. Not much compared to St. Louis, I expect, but it's solid and dry. It looks like paradise to me, Grace murmured, and Xavier felt something stir in his chest at her words. He helped her inside, settling her on his bed while he quickly built a fire in the stone fireplace and heated water. With gentle efficiency, he treated her sunburn with a salve made from plants he'd learned about from a Cheyenne medicine woman years before. He prepared a simple broth, coaxing her to take small sips and clean the cuts on her hands and feet. You should rest now, he said when he'd done all he could. Tomorrow you'll feel stronger, and we can figure out what to do next. Grace caught his hand as he turned to leave. Where will you sleep? I've got a bedroll by the fire. I've slept in worse places, he assured her with a smile. Thank you, she whispered, her eyes already closing with exhaustion. I don't know how to repay such kindness. Xavier shook his head. No need for payment, Miss Anderson. Out here, we help each other. It's the only way to survive. As he settled by the fire, Xavier found himself watching the steady rise and fall of her chest, reassuring himself that she would recover. Something about this woman stirred protective instincts he hadn't known he possessed. Perhaps it was her vulnerability, or the courage it must have taken to keep walking when all hope seemed lost. Whatever it was, he knew with certainty that he would do whatever necessary to ensure her safety. Grace woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through a small window. For a moment, she was disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings causing a spike of panic until memories of the previous day flooded back, the endless walking, collapsing on the prairie, and the quiet-spoken cowboy who had followed her tracks and saved her life. She sat up slowly, surprised to find her strength somewhat restored. A pitcher of water and a cup had been placed on a small table beside the bed, along with a clean shirt and trousers that would clearly swim on her smaller frame. The cabin door opened, and Xavier entered, carrying an armful of firewood. He stopped when he saw she was awake, a smile spreading across his weathered face. Morning, he said. You're looking better already. Grace self-consciously touched her tangled hair. I must look a fright. Xavier shook his head. You look like someone who survived when many wouldn't have. He nodded toward the clothes. I left those for you. Thought you might want to get cleaned up. There's a wash basin behind that screen, and I've heated water for you. His eyes were kind but respectful. I'll tend to the horses while you freshen up. Take your time. After he'd gone, Grace gratefully washed away the grime of her ordeal, wincing at the tender sunburn on her face and arms. The borrowed clothes were comically large but clean and soft from many washings. She rolled up the sleeves and pant legs, used a piece of rope as a belt, and felt immeasurably better for the simple act of being clean. When Xavier returned, he carried a basket of eggs and some wild onions. Thought you might be hungry, he said, setting to work preparing breakfast as naturally as if he cooked for guests every day. Grace watched him move efficiently around the small space. He was tall and lean, with the muscled build of a man who worked hard for his living. His face was tanned from years in the sun, with laugh lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though his expression frequently settled into a watchful alertness that spoke of hard-earned caution. May I help? She asked, feeling awkward sitting while he worked. Xavier glanced up, seeming to assess her strength. If you're feeling up to it, you could slice the bread. It's not fresh baked, I'm afraid, just what I brought back from town. They worked together in comfortable silence, and Grace found herself relaxing despite the strangeness of her situation. There was something about Xavier's presence that felt safe, a quality she hadn't experienced with Richard even in the early days of their courtship. Over breakfast, she told him more about herself, how she'd grown up in a respectable St. Louis family, educated but sheltered, how Richard had courted her with tales of adventure and promises of a beautiful life in California, and how her parents had objected to the match. I was so determined to prove them wrong, she said sadly. They said he was only after my dowry, but I was too stubborn to listen. We all make mistakes when we're young, Xavier said gently. Some just cost more than others. What about you? Grace asked, eager to shift the focus from her own foolishness. How did you end up here, all alone on the prairie? Xavier's eyes grew distant for a moment. I came west after the war, fought for the Union, though plenty out here didn't. Tried my hand at a few things, but I had a knack for tracking and horses. He shrugged. Eventually saved enough to claim this land. It's not much, but it's mine. You never married? The question slipped out before she could consider its propriety. A shadow crossed his face. Was engaged once, to a girl back in Illinois. She died of fever before I returned from the war. He offered a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. After that, well, opportunities don't come along often out here, and I've been busy making a living. Grace felt a pang of sympathy. I'm sorry. That must have been terribly difficult. Xavier nodded his acknowledgement, then stood to clear the dishes. What would you like to do now, Miss Anderson? Once you're stronger, I can take you to the nearest town, Cedar Springs, about a day's ride from here. They have a stage connection that could get you back to St. Louis, if that's where you want to go. Grace hadn't thought that far ahead. The prospect of returning to St. Louis in disgrace, facing her parents' sympathy and the community's gossip, was almost unbearable. Yet what alternatives did she have? She was alone on the frontier with no money, no possessions, and a husband who had tried to kill her. I don't know, she admitted. I can't go back to St. Louis. Not yet. But I can't impose on your kindness indefinitely. You're not imposing, Xavier said firmly. You can stay here until you decide what you want to do. This land might be lonely, but it's peaceful. A good place to think. Over the next several days, Grace's strength returned rapidly. She insisted on helping with the daily chores, cooking, cleaning, tending the small vegetable garden Xavier had started behind the cabin. He taught her how to collect eggs from the handful of chickens that scratched in the yard, how to milk the gentle cow he kept, and how to make soap from rendered fat and lye. To her surprise, she found she enjoyed the simple rhythms of homestead life. There was something deeply satisfying about physical work that produced immediate, tangible results so different from the endless social obligations and superficial accomplishments that had filled her days in St. Louis. Xavier proved to be patient and knowledgeable, never condescending when she made mistakes. He seemed genuinely impressed by how quickly she adapted to frontier life, praising her resilience and determination. Most city women would be falling apart. He commented one evening as they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the prairie sky. But you just keep going. Grace smiled, oddly pleased by his assessment. I suppose I'm discovering I'm made of sterner stuff than I realized. She hesitated before adding. Or perhaps it's the company. You make it easy to be brave, Mr. Russell. She thought she saw color rise beneath his tan, but he merely nodded and changed the subject, pointing out a hawk circling in the distance. As days stretched into a week, Grace found herself watching Xavier when he wasn't looking, the confident way he handled his horses, the gentleness in his hands as he tended a wounded rabbit they'd found, the quiet concentration on his face as he read one of the few books he owned by firelight in the evenings. She was developing feelings for this quiet, honorable man who had saved her life and asked nothing in return, feelings that both excited and terrified her. She was still married, after all, even if her husband had abandoned her to die. And Xavier had given no indication that he saw her as anything but a woman in need of assistance. Their comfortable routine was shattered one afternoon when Xavier returned from checking his fences with a grim expression. Riders coming. he said tersely, reaching for the rifle he kept by the door. 4 of them, moving fast from the east. Grace's heart stuttered. Richard. Xavier shook his head. Can't tell from this distance, but it's unusual to see a group that size moving with such purpose. He handed her a small revolver. Do you know how to use this? She shook her head, wide-eyed. Simple enough. Point and pull the trigger, but only if absolutely necessary. He demonstrated how to cock the hammer, his larger hands enveloping hers. Stay inside. If anything happens to me, take Pepper and ride southwest toward Cedar Springs. Don't stop for anyone. The matter-of-fact way he discussed his potential death chilled her, but before she could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats filled the air. Xavier positioned himself on the porch, rifle held ready but not aimed, his posture alert but not openly hostile. 4 riders appeared around the bend in the trail, and Grace, peering through the window, felt her blood freeze. In the lead was Richard, his once handsome face twisted with anger. Behind him rode 3 rough-looking men she didn't recognize. Russell, Richard called, reining his horse to a stop several yards from the cabin. I hear you found something that belongs to me. Xavier didn't move. Don't know what you're talking about, stranger. Richard's face darkened. My wife, Grace Anderson. Word in town is you brought in a woman matching her description. News travels fast, Xavier commented neutrally. And what makes you think any woman here would be your wife? Because she's a thief and a liar, Richard snarled. Stole money from me and our traveling companions, then ran off when confronted. I've been tracking her for weeks. Grace's hands tightened around the revolver. The sheer audacity of his lies made her tremble with fury. Outside, Xavier's expression remained impassive. Funny thing about lies, he said conversationally. They don't tend to match the evidence. Found a woman half dead from exposure on the prairie days ago. No money, no supplies, nothing but the clothes on her back. Doesn't sound much like a thief to me. One of the men with Richard shifted uncomfortably. Anderson, you said she rode off with a man. Didn't say nothing about leaving her to die. Shut up, Jenkins, Richard snapped, then turned back to Xavier. Look, Russell, this isn't your concern. She's my wife by law, and I'm taking her back. Any woman who chooses to stay under my roof is under my protection, Xavier replied, his voice hardening. So I suggest you turn around and leave. Now. Richard's hand moved toward his gun, but Xavier was faster, his rifle raised, and aimed in one fluid motion. I wouldn't, he advised softly. I was a sharpshooter in the 2nd Illinois. Can put a bullet through your eye at twice this distance. A tense silence followed. Then Grace made her decision. Setting the revolver carefully on the table, she opened the door and stepped onto the porch beside Xavier. Hello, Richard, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Richard's eyes narrowed. Grace, get your things. We're leaving. I'm not going anywhere with you, she replied calmly. Not after you drugged me and left me to die on the prairie. Richard's expression flickered, and he glanced at his companions, clearly gauging their reaction. She's confused. Delirious from the sun. I found her tracks, Anderson, Xavier interrupted coldly. Followed them for miles. She wasn't running away. She was wandering in circles, disoriented and dying of thirst. No supplies, no water, no horse. His eyes hardened. Only a coward leaves a woman to die like that. The man called Jenkins looked increasingly uncomfortable. Anderson, you swore she just ran off. Said nothing about leaving her to die. She's lying, Richard insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. I think we all know who's lying here, Xavier replied. Now, I'll say it one more time. Leave. Richard's face contorted with rage. She's my wife. Not anymore, Grace said firmly. No court in the land would keep a woman bound to a man who tried to murder her. For a terrible moment, she thought Richard would draw his gun despite Xavier's warning. Then Jenkins and another of the men turned their horses around. Come on, Anderson, Jenkins called. This ain't worth dying over. Woman clearly don't want to go with you, and this fella seems mighty determined. Richard's furious gaze darted between Grace and Xavier. This isn't over, he hissed, but he turned his horse regardless, following his departing companions with obvious reluctance. Xavier kept his rifle trained on them until they disappeared from sight. Only then did he lower the weapon, turning to Grace with concern in his eyes. Are you all right? She nodded, though her knees felt weak with reaction. Yes, thank you. He guided her gently back inside, his hand warm and steady on her elbow. I don't think they'll be back. Those men with him didn't seem too pleased to learn the truth. I can't believe he found me, Grace said, sinking into a chair. Xavier's expression was grim. I'm not surprised. Word spreads fast out here, too few people over too much space. Someone in town probably mentioned I'd brought in a woman when I went for supplies. He hesitated. What you said out there, about no court keeping you married to him. Were you serious? Grace looked up at him, suddenly understanding the deeper question. Yes, she said softly. Even before this happened, I knew my marriage was a mistake. Richard never loved me. He only wanted my family's connections and my dowry. She swallowed hard. But I was too proud to admit I'd been wrong, too afraid of the scandal if I left him. Xavier nodded slowly. And now? What do you want now, Grace? The use of her first name, something he'd carefully avoided until now, sent warmth spreading through her. She stood, gathering her courage to face him directly. I want to start over, she said. I want to build a life that's honest and real, not based on appearances and society's expectations. She took a deep breath. I've been happier here in this cabin, doing simple work with my hands, than I ever was in St. Louis. Something flickered in Xavier's eyes. Hope, perhaps. It's a hard life, he warned. Winters are brutal. Summers are punishing. There's always more work than hours in the day. I know, she said simply. I've seen enough to understand that. But I've also seen how rewarding it can be. She hesitated, then added in a rush. And I've seen what kind of man you are, Xavier Russell. Kind and honorable and brave. He stepped closer, his expression suddenly vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. Grace, are you saying what I think you're saying? She smiled, her heart pounding. I'm saying that if you wanted me to stay not just until I decide what to do next, but to stay permanently, I would consider that the greatest blessing of my life. For a moment, he didn't move, and Grace felt a flutter of panic. Had she misread everything? Then his hand came up to gently cup her cheek, his touch as light as a butterfly's wing. I've been afraid to hope, he confessed quietly. You're educated, refined, used to so much more than I can offer. And after what you've been through, I didn't want to pressure you in any way. You've offered me something I never had before, Grace replied, leaning slightly into his touch. Respect, kindness without conditions. The chance to discover who I really am, not who everyone expects me to be. Xavier's thumb brushed lightly across her cheekbone. I knew from the moment I found you on that prairie that you were someone special. Your courage, your determination to survive, it humbled me. His voice deepened. And every day since, I found myself falling deeper under your spell. Grace's heart soared at his words. So ask me, she whispered. A smile spread slowly across his face, crinkling those laugh lines she'd come to adore. Grace Anderson, would you consider staying here, building a life with me on this homestead? It won't be easy, and I can't promise wealth or luxury. But I can promise to respect you, protect you, and love you until my dying day. Tears of joy welled in her eyes. Yes, she said simply. Yes, with all my heart. His kiss was gentle at first, a question rather than a demand. When she responded eagerly, it deepened into something passionate yet tender, a promise of all that would come. When they finally parted, both breathing quickly, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. We'll need to handle the legal matters, he said, practical even in this moment. Get your marriage dissolved properly, do things right. Grace nodded. Yes. And I should write to my parents. Let them know I'm alive and well. She smiled. They may be shocked at first, but I think they'll come to understand. They only ever wanted my happiness. And are you happy, Grace? Xavier asked, his eyes searching hers. Truly happy with this choice. She looked around the simple cabin that had become her sanctuary, then back at this remarkable man who had followed her tracks across the prairie and, in doing so, had found a path to her heart. Happier than I ever dreamed possible, she assured him, sealing her words with another kiss. 2 years later, Grace stood on the porch of the expanded cabin, watching as Xavier demonstrated to their infant son how to gentle a new foal. The homestead had flourished under their joint care. The garden now produced abundantly. A small orchard was taking root, and a second bedroom had been added to accommodate their growing family. The legal dissolution of her marriage to Richard had proceeded smoothly, especially after evidence emerged that he had indeed stolen from the wagon train company. Last they'd heard, he was serving time in a California prison for fraud. Grace's parents had initially been shocked by her letters, but eventually had made the journey west to meet the man their daughter had chosen. They'd arrived skeptical, but left impressed by Xavier's character and the obvious happiness of their daughter. They now wrote regularly and had sent generous gifts for their grandson's birth. Xavier looked up and caught her watching, a smile spreading across his face that still made her heart skip. He said something to little Thomas, then crossed the yard to join her on the porch. "What has you looking so thoughtful, Mrs. Russell?" he asked, slipping an arm around her waist. Grace leaned into his embrace. "I was just thinking about how different my life would have been if you hadn't found my tracks that day." Xavier's arm tightened around her. "I thank God every day that I did." "As do I," she murmured, tilting her face up for his kiss. "As do I." As the sun set over the prairie they both now called home, painting the endless grass in shades of gold and amber, Grace reflected that sometimes being lost was the only way to find where you truly belonged. She had been abandoned in the middle of the plains, left to die alone and forgotten. But a cowboy had found her tracks and followed, and in doing so, had led her to a life and love beyond anything she could have imagined.